Okay. Okay, well, welcome back everyone to this continued virtual semester of the Climate People Environment Program Seminar Series. We have a little bit of an abbreviated series this semester, mostly from not wanting to overload everyone's schedules with so many virtual meetings, and also the fact that I'm actually on leave from university. So I've had the opportunity to get a few and rope in some amazing speakers, with the first one being today's. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrea Dutton, who is a professor in the Geoscience department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her background is in paleoclimate and paleoceanography, and also is known for her work in sea level change and also with using isotope geochemistry. Prior to arriving at Madison, she was a faculty at the University of Florida, and prior to that, she did her bachelor's at Amherst College, her master's and PhD at the University of Michigan. We've been trying for some time to have Dr. Dutton come and give an in-person seminar, because one of our big hopes, given the overlaps in the research and the types of research that people do at the Center for Climatic Research, was hopefully some future collaboration, potentially affiliation in CCR. Since we're in the long haul with this pandemic, we decided that we should move ahead anyway. And so we are going to do our standard seminar and Q&A, but for those who want to stick around a little bit afterwards, and especially if you're directly affiliated and want to talk more about CCR, we're hoping to kind of continue to chat for a little bit longer past the hour, and we'll go from there. So please mute if you haven't already, and you're welcome to put in questions into chat for now, and I'll make sure to pay attention to those. And otherwise, we'll do Q&A the usual way by raising your hand or chat at the end. Of course, we always prefer if students or early career scientists ask some of the earlier first questions, but if there aren't any of those, we'll continue with everyone else. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea. Thanks.
Great, thank you for the introduction. Well, it's very nice to be here today. Of course, I'd rather be in person to meet all of you. One of the challenging things about moving to Madison during the pandemic is I haven't been able to get out across campus and meet people and make connections. So I hope that today is a little bit of a first step in doing that. And so I hope conversations definitely continue past this hour. So in choosing what I was going to talk about today, I want to tell you everything that I do, because I want to open up lots of different avenues of collaboration with people across campus, but I'll have to limit myself a little bit. So I've kept it more of kind of a high overview of some of the big research questions that my research group has been working on over the last several years, and what we're trying to answer, and where we are with that progress, some of the things that we're grappling with, to give you a little bit of an idea of that. I also wanted to give a nod to Fulbright New Zealand. That's why I was last year on sabbatical, learning more about the Antarctic continent. They have an Antarctic Research Center in Wellington, so I spent time there when the pandemic hit, which was probably the best place in the world to be at the time. I have to say it was a little bit hard to leave New Zealand and come back here. But it was really an exciting time to be with those people there. And so we have some collaborations that are moving into the future as well. So the title of today's talk is What Earth's Past Can Tell Us About Our Watery Future, which is really a nod to the acknowledgement that as sea level rises, our coastlines will get flooded, and it's not really a question of if anymore, it's more of a question of when. And so a lot of the research that I do kind of addresses this question to kind of help coastal planners as we move into the future. What is it that we can expect as we experience sustained global warming and sea level rise? So I'm going to touch on a lot of different projects today. So I decided to just put up a slide with lots of different names on it to acknowledge the work of a lot of students and postdocs that have gone into this, and especially to highlight my collaborator, Jody Webster, who's shown in the picture on the right here. He's at the University of Sydney, and he's had some students, and we kind of have co-advised many of these students together working at field sites across the globe. And I'm going to show you some pictures of some of those as we go through this. So in the abstract, if you read the abstract that came out with the talk announcement, I mentioned this concept of extreme events kind of impacting the shape, the kind of the arc of our lifetime experience. And right now we are experiencing events that feel like, in some cases, once in a lifetime events, because in the past century, that's what these events were. So these horrific wildfires, for example, in Australia, last year, we were sitting in New Zealand watching these, hoping to visit our relatives in Australia, but we were not able to visit because of the wildfires. We had to postpone our trip and then eventually cancel it when the pandemic hit. So we never made it to Australia when we were in New Zealand. Of course, after these wildfires, what didn't make the news as much was this heat wave that partly affected this drought and the wildfires, then hit the coral reefs in the form of coral bleaching. And it was yet another major coral bleaching event. We've had several over the last several years that are really threatening the health of the Great Barrier Reef and reefs around the globe. The picture on the right is now several years old. Many of you may have seen this circulating on social media before, but this is a picture in a parking garage in South Florida, Miami Beach, I believe, and in the middle on the floor there, if you can make out, there is an octopus in this parking garage. And this image really, to me, says, like, what are we waiting for? This is happening already now. The ocean wants to be here, not your cars. And so this is an issue that we need to face head on. And what's sitting in the background, and again, is an image that many of you may be familiar with, are these global warming stripes that show in color the change in temperatures over the past century or so. And this is an image that really gets across how quickly the temperatures are accelerating and how different what we are living through today compared to what we grew up in, or for sure, what our parents experienced as they grew up. So these are events that are going to be happening more frequently as we move into the future. So as we communicate that science to the public, unfortunately, when it comes to sea level rise, a lot of times the images that get used are something like this. They show pictures of ice sheets and polar bears, and they talk about the motivation being like, save the polar bear. And to me, this really misses the mark, because this makes it seem like the problem is far away. It's going to impact things at the poles. And it doesn't make any connection how it's going to impact us as humans or how it will affect our lives. And so I actually spend a lot of time communicating my research and doing outreach in general on the topics of climate change and sea level rise. And instead of using images like these, I like to help people to really connect the dots on how what we are seeing is going to impact our lives. And so I think it's really important that we literally and figuratively place humans into this picture of the future. So this is an image that I really like when I talk about sea level rise. Instead of just showing a graph of a projection of what sea level is going to do in the future, this is what it will look like and feel like. So in each of these panels, there are people, and it says, for example, we'll look at the one on the far right, it says, when Lauren reaches her life expectancy in 2078, sea level in the place where she lives, which is Miami Beach, Florida, will be 36 inches, so some 3 feet higher than today. That's on top of what we already have. So during the king tides, flooding in this area can already get up to 2 feet high. So now you're adding another 3 feet on 2 feet. Lauren is going to be completely underwater. But of course, she's going to grow before 2078. But someone her size would be completely underwater. And I think when people see this, it really hits them that, wow, this is going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem in my lifetime. And we're not going to be able to cope with that type of sea level rise. Whereas when you put up just kind of a graph with a curve, it's too abstract to kind of connect to. And so this is a common theme in a lot of the research that I do. So the one thing that we're trying to do to help coastal planners to prepare is to try to understand how high will sea level rise and how quickly is that going to play out. And the way that we do that is by looking at past warm periods to try to understand the dynamics of these ice sheets under sustained warming conditions. When it was warmer than present, how did these ice sheets respond? How much did they retreat and how quickly did they retreat? And so today I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey to the past to talk to you about a time period known as the Last Interglacial. So interglacial is the name given to these warm periods between ice ages or glacial periods. So this is a cartoon that is showing you sea level on the vertical axis, which is at 0 today, going back in time to the right. And these numbers are in thousands of years. Ka is kiloaño. You'll see that on a lot of the axes in this talk. And you can see that there are these kind of 100,000-year cycles that we have here, where we have large ice sheets and sea level falls, and those ice sheets melt. You have a rapid sea level rise. The ice sheets grow again, and this kind of cycle repeats itself. So this is the last warm period, and we use it somewhat as an analog for the future, because sea level was higher during this warm period and temperatures at the poles were warmer than today. And so we can use it to understand how the system responds and how quickly it responds. And of course, on these same timescales, we also have temperature that's changing, carbon dioxide, all these things going along in concert. So part of the arc of my story today is to think about, what have we learned? I mean, I'm not the first person to think about studying the last interglacial and looking at sea level change. People have been looking at this for decades. And in fact, back in 1968, this guy named John Mercer published this now landmark paper talking about evidence that he saw in Antarctica, which to him, looking at the sedimentary evidence that they found in Antarctica, indicated that summer temperatures were some 7 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than today. And that they knew that this probably happened at some point within the Pleistocene. They couldn't say exactly when, but that the West Antarctic ice sheet is vulnerable. And there was a time period in the last interglacial where sea level was about 6 meters higher. That's about what he estimated you would expect if the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed. And so he hypothesized that maybe this is what happened, that this sedimentary evidence is evidence that the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed during the last interglacial. And if that's true, we need to be worried about what's going to happen in our future. And for the 50 years since then, people have been trying to test this hypothesis. Did the West Antarctic ice sheet collapse during the last interglacial? And so that's part of the arc of the story today, is to assess how far we've come in our understanding in answering that question. We have certainly learned a lot about the Antarctic ice sheet and the Antarctic continent over that time period. This gives you a little bit of perspective on that. The image on the left-hand side is the first composite satellite image that was ever made of the Antarctic continent. And you can see the extent of the sea ice here. This was made in September of 1964. Compared to this image on the right, which is actually the superposition of, I think, 4 different data sets. You have sea ice on there, the topography, the digital elevation model. You have the color that's according to the temperature change per decade. I can't remember what the 4th data set is, but obviously we've learned an incredible amount, much more high resolution data. We've gone to Antarctica, we've drilled ice cores, we've gone in boats, we've drilled marine cores off the edge of the continents. It tells us something about the history of the ice sheet on that continent. So we have all of this new data, and we're going to kind of look at collectively what we know from the ice sheet, but also from other places around the globe, can tell us something about that was happening in Antarctica, and see what we have learned. So obviously the motivation for this, which you got a sense in the beginning with some of those pictures I showed you, comes from data like this. These are satellite altimetry data looking at sea level rise over the past few decades. Now this graph only goes back to 1993, because that's the first time we put satellite into orbit that was measuring sea level. And we've had one up there continuously since then, although different satellites over time. And if you look at this, it suggests that if you put just a line through it, somewhere around 3 millimeters a year. And it actually has been accelerating, statistically significant, detectable over this time period. Accelerations is actually getting closer to 4 millimeters a year now. But you know, when you're talking to public audiences, it doesn't sound very impressive, right? 3 millimeters a year, right? It's like the thickness of 2 pennies stacked one on top of each other. You know, how is this going to affect my beach house? That's what people want to know. How is this going to affect my beach house? Do I need to sell, right? And they look at this and they're like, hey, I'm good, right? But it turns out that this is a considerable acceleration over what we've seen in the past. Even if you look at the last century, these data now come from tide gauges, not from satellites. Using the same data set, what you see here are 3 different interpretations from that data set, 3 different lab groups estimating what the global average sea level has done over this kind of century scale time period that is shown here with 1900 on the left-hand side. And there's disagreement as you go farther back in time because there are far fewer tide gauge data. You have to kind of interpolate what the whole global average is, and people have a different way of doing that. But it doesn't really matter, no matter which of these lines or curves you want to look at, there's clear agreement that it's been rising, that it has been accelerating, and the data we have indicates that this is predominantly due to the expansion of water as it heats up and the contribution from the melting of mountain glaciers. Those are the 2 things that dominate the sea level rise signal over this time scale. But in the coming century, mass loss from polar ice sheets, that meaning Greenland and Antarctica, is expected to exceed other contributions to global sea level rise under future warming. That's because we are seeing an accelerating signal in both of those ice sheets in terms of their melt rate. And that is the motivation for kind of looking at these past warm periods and really focusing in on these polar ice sheets to understand what can we learn from the retreat or the collapse of these ice sheets during past warm periods that can help us to make more robust projections of ice sheet response as we move into the future and try to understand when we might reach, for example, critical tipping points in the system. So to understand this, I want to explain a little bit more about the vulnerability of the Antarctic ice sheet in particular, which is one that you often hear about in the news when there's another sea level story out, or, with all have the same kind of lead in these articles of, sea level rise happening faster than we expected. One of the things they often talk about is the West Antarctic ice sheet. So what you're looking at here is an image of the ice sheet, looking at it from the side. And the East Antarctic ice sheet is this big, large hulking mass on the right-hand side, and the West Antarctic ice sheet is over here on the left. So you might say, why are we worried about the West Antarctic ice sheet? It seems smaller than the East Antarctica, which it indeed is. But when we look at the rate of kind of mass loss, so ice that's being discharged out of these outlet glaciers into the ocean, what these data are showing you, these big fat red circles are scary things. They're showing you have more than 10 gigatons a year that you are losing out of these glaciers, and the size of the circle is proportional to the rate of discharge of ice that you're losing here. So we have these very fast flowing outlet glaciers. And the other problem that we have with the West Antarctic ice sheet is that most of it, if you look at this image in the middle, is actually based below sea level. What do I mean by that? Is that the weight of this ice sheet is pressing down on the surface of the Earth so that the elevation of that bedrock beneath the ice sheet has been depressed below sea level. So what happens now, all this area in light blue, so the transition from at 0 meters of elevation is from green to blue. This part of the ice sheet is all based below sea level. So as the Southern Ocean warms in temperature, you have those warm waters kind of bathing the underbelly of this ice sheet. And indeed, in model runs that ice sheet modelers are running, when you warm the oceans by a couple degrees, you get retreat that looks something like this. You lose all this part in these marine-based sectors. The reason for that, you can kind of see perhaps a little more clearly in this cartoon here, is that again, you have this water, this warm water, as I said, bathing the underbelly of the ice sheet. You have an ice shelf here, and this point here, that's called the grounding line. It's where the ice and the water and the earth meet, right? It's kind of that triple point there. Currently, this ice sheet is pinned on this relatively high point here. Behind it, because of the weight of the ice sheet, it slopes down backwards. It has this what we refer to as a reverse slope geometry. So as this melts, if this ice sheet starts to retreat past this grounding line, there's nothing else sticking up for it to get stuck on, for it to get pinned on. It will start to retreat down this reverse slope with nothing to stop it. So this is a critical physical tipping point in this system that we are worried about crossing, because once you cross it, you can't just say, oh, we're going to reduce our emissions and repent our sins and it's okay and sea level won't rise. Once you start this process off, it's going to retreat all the way down this slope. So this is why we are so concerned about what is going on with the West Antarctic ice sheet. So let's see what we can learn about that by looking at Earth's past in some of these past warm periods. So what I do is, instead of going to the Antarctic ice sheet, like a lot of my colleagues do to do their research, I go to tropical islands around the world, which is not a bad deal. I use fossil corals that live near the sea surface to track the position of sea level through time. So this map shows you some of the classic sites that have been used in a lot of the sea level literature that use this technique. So we collect samples of these corals out in the field. We study their context within the reef to try to understand exactly where the position of sea level was. We do detailed elevation measurements, not like this. This would be pretty lax. We use higher technology than that. And when we take these samples back to the lab, we date them using a radiometric dating system that relies on uranium and thorium isotopes to tell us exactly the time when this coral grew. And so using that age information and the elevation information we get, combined with understanding the water depth of these corals, we can reconstruct the position of sea level through time. And fundamentally, you really only need those two things to make a graph of sea level through time. You need two axes, right? You have age and elevation. So you have your chronology and your elevation. And this is how a lot of the literature has actually proceeded in trying to reconstruct sea level. Unfortunately, when you do that, you go to different sites around the globe, you start to realize that the data you have from individual sites doesn't seem to match some of the other sites. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of people were ignoring a lot of the other information that is actually in the outcrop that they can use to provide a better context. So instead of, in other words, connecting the dots for each data point you have to say, well, did sea level actually fall at that point, or was that coral actually maybe living a little bit deeper in the water column? So we're going actually back to some of these sites that people have studied before and looking at this in a more holistic way. So the research that I do is very interdisciplinary. I work very closely with reef paleobiologists to study the assemblages of corals and algae in the reef to understand exactly what water depth we're looking at. We work very closely with geophysical modelers because we have to worry about how vertical land motions due to several different processes might affect our interpretation of the vertical position of these corals and at sea level through time. And we also use a lot of information that's embedded in the sedimentology, the stratigraphy, and even the preservation of these corals that tells us something about the history of sea level. And by doing this, we're starting to build kind of a more cohesive picture of a reconstruction of what happened to sea level during this past warm period of the last interglacial that I'm going to talk a little bit more about now. So several years ago, we wrote this review paper, which is kind of a good context place to start off on. This was done with an international working group that I helped to lead for a 5-year period in here. And it involves ice sheet modelers, climate modelers, people working on the ice sheets, people like myself reconstructing sea level. So basically a lot of people thinking about the same questions, but approaching it from very different angles. So we came together to write this review paper to try to say, well, what is it that we can agree upon as a community that we understand? And where are the gaps in our understanding when we look at these past warm periods and trying to understand the dynamics of these polar ice sheets? So this was the big summary kind of cartoon that came out of this review paper, and I will walk you through this step by step. So each one of these columns represents the position of sea level for different time periods. So this one on the left is present day, which by definition is at 0. And then these are 3 warm periods during the warmest periods during the last couple million years. This one here is this last interglacial period that I've been talking about 125,000 years ago. I'm not going to talk too much about these right now, although you can ask me questions about these other warm periods. The other information you see on this cartoon is kind of the average estimate of the global temperature during all of these time periods. We are already at about 1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial. which actually is about the same that we were at during the last interglacial. Without uncertainty, that temperature, global temperature, is about the same. The other information is what carbon dioxide was doing in each of these time periods. So when you look at this collectively, it suggests that during these past warm periods, when the global average temperature was anywhere from 1 to 3 degrees warmer than today, that sea level was at least 6 meters higher, if not more, during each of these time periods. And this suggests that the ice sheets today are really out of equilibrium with this temperature that we have pushed to very quickly, because of course, the way we got here is by increasing our greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere very rapidly. And so these ice sheets are still catching up. I liken this to, taking 2 ice cubes and throwing them into a hot room. They're not going to melt right away, but we're now kind of sitting back and watching them melt and wondering, how quickly is this going to happen? Because this evidence that we have from the geologic record suggests that we may already be in for something like 6 meters of sea level rise, even with just the amount of warming that has already occurred, not to mention the warming that is coming in the future. So that was really the main takeaway from this review paper, that during these recent interglacial periods, what sound like small increases in global mean temperature actually can have a very large impact on sea level rise. And this are some of the imagery that Climate Central helped to produce when this paper came out to help communicate these results. This is what Florida would look like with just the low end, 6 meters of sea level rise, which actually makes a lot of sense. This whole area of South Florida is covered with shallow marine deposits from this time period, right? So that's additional evidence that we know that sea level was higher then. This is what New York City would look like with 6 meters of sea level rise, right? So this is kind of the depressing part of the talk. This is what we may already be in for if we take this kind of somewhat simplistic analysis that I just showed you in the last cartoon, because obviously it's going to be a little bit more complicated than that, as you will see. But the other factor to throw in on top of this is that sea level is not going to rise uniformly, like filling up a bathtub around the globe. It does make a difference which ice sheet is doing the melting. So as you can see from this image here, the geographic pattern of sea level rise varies depending on whether we are getting melting. Let's say it's all coming from Greenland in this image on the left-hand side, or if it's all coming from West Antarctica. You can see that the amount of sea level rise is very different across the globe. Somewhat surprisingly, maybe perhaps counterintuitively, you get regions of sea level fall within the vicinity of the ice sheet. How can that be? That's because of gravity. So this doesn't work very well on Zoom because I like to use my hands to explain this, but I'm going to try. So when you have a large ice sheet, it's so large that it has its own gravitational attraction. So the water in the ocean is attracted to that ice sheet, right? So in fact, the sea level slopes up towards the ice sheet because of that gravitational attraction. So you start to melt that ice sheet, sea level will fall in the vicinity of that ice sheet because you've lost that gravitational attraction. But if you can see my elbow in the Zoom video, sea level's falling in the region of the ice sheet, but in what we call the far field, far away from the ice sheet, sea level is rising more rapidly, right? So you can talk about average sea level rise, but that doesn't really give you the picture of what's going to happen where you live, because it will vary across the globe. So that means that here in North America, we need to be more worried about what is happening in West Antarctica. Not that we shouldn't be worried about Greenland, but this will have a bigger impact for the same amount of melt, if you will, if it's coming from West Antarctica. Okay, so when we look at the last interglacial, this column shows us kind of our estimated budget of where this meltwater has come from during that time period. How did we get to that 6 to 9 meters, which is 20 to 30 feet, if you can picture that better in your head. Some of it would be due to thermal expansion, and even if we melt all the mountain glaciers that we have today on the globe, that would only get us up to something like 1 meter of sea level rise. So anything more than 1 meter, you have to tap into the polar ice sheets to explain it. We have data and a lot of models from Greenland, and we know that part of the Greenland ice sheet did retreat during this warm period, but not all of it. We have ice that is last interglacial in A's still preserved in Greenland under the northern dome of that ice sheet. So most of the estimates come in at about estimating the amount we got out of Greenland would have contributed about 2 meters on average around the globe of sea level rise, plus or minus about 1.5 meters, which is a very large uncertainty, mind you. So then maybe that could get us up to 4.5 at the outer limit. But if we're going to get into this 6 to 9 range, it really suggests that we had to tap into the Antarctic ice sheet. So that was one of the big outcomes of this estimate of 6 to 9 meters. It implied that, yes, perhaps the Antarctic ice sheet did collapse, at least one sector of it during the last interglacial, to explain this budget. But this cartoon that I'm showing you here assumes that the timing of maximum retreat in both hemispheres, so for both those ice sheets, was simultaneous, right? So that at the time that you had the highest sea level during the last interglacial, it was also the time at which Greenland and Antarctic ice sheet were kind of at their smallest volume during that time period, which is not necessarily true. The forcing was not the same. Today we're heating up the globe because we have these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They're forcing both poles at the same time. So both of those ice sheets are responding at the same time. There's evidence from the last interglacial that it was warmer in the southern hemisphere early on, and it was warmer in the northern hemisphere later in the last interglacial, because this time period spans some 10,000 years or so. So if there's this difference in forcing, there may have been a difference in the response of the ice sheets. They're not necessarily responding in phase with each other, if you will. So there's a possibility that it's a little bit more complicated than that. In addition, after we published this paper in 2015, there was a paper that came out that suggested, well, maybe Greenland actually contributed something like 5 meters of sea level rise, which totally changes this budget. If that's true, it gets us into this range of 6 to 9 meters. Now we don't need the Antarctic ice sheet at all. So then at this point, you can kind of throw up your hands and say, what have we learned? Can we say that the Antarctic ice sheet has collapsed or not? And I think we can say more than this, as I'm about to show you. So I want to share with you some results that we have from looking at several field sites around the globe, some of these different fossil coral reefs, and how they can help us to answer some of these questions that I've just laid out here. So on this slide, I'm showing you tantalizing images of data that we have from several different sites around the globe. And what we're focused in on now is not so much, how high did sea level get, or what was the maximum height, the position of sea level. We're trying to understand, how did sea level evolve through this warm period? Did it rise slowly? At some point we have some sudden jump in sea level rise that might suggest a collapse in a sector of an ice sheet? Or do we have sea level going up and down, as some people have suggested? And we're trying to put some good chronology on this to get a better handle on what were the rates of sea level rise, because that is the big question that people always want to know is, well, how quickly, right? And so we want to think about human timescales. How quickly is sea level going to rise? So the picture that's emerging now from all of these sites is that sea level wasn't stable during this warm period, that it was rising, but not steadily. There's evidence that sea level was actually oscillating. It was going up and down during this warm period, which is kind of intriguing. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. I'm going to show you some evidence we have in particular from the Seychelles and from Western Australia, where we've been working in the past few years. So a lot of this work in the Seychelles has been conducted by my former PhD student, Karen Biverberg, who's written a few papers on this. The Seychelles are these islands in the Western Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa here. And they sit on this shallow bank, which is actually a sliver of continental crust that was left behind when Madagascar rifted away from India millions and millions of years ago. And since then, it's thought to be tectonically quiescent and so fairly stable in terms of its elevation. And when I first went to the Seychelles, this is the type of outcrop that I saw. This is what's left of the fossil reef, because there is such intense rainfall in this tropical region. You can see it's actually even been weathering the granite bedrock in these gorgeous fluted and rilled structures. The chemical weathering is intense here. That means most of the last interglacial fossil reef is actually gone. It's been weathered away, it's karstified. The only places where we preserve fragments of this reef are in these areas that are protected by these overhangs of granite bedrock. It's in these little pockets closest to land. So it's actually kind of the farthest that sea level got inland during this time period. And serendipitously, because there still is serendipity left in science, it turns out that we preserved the shallowest part of the reef here in these overhangs. So what we are looking at, these kind of vertical strips of outcrop, which at first I thought was an artifact of the weathering that had gone on. Maybe that's how they weathered and you were left with these weird little strips in the rills of the granite. But when you go snorkeling out on the reef, so in the bottom right-hand picture, if you can see, if you go snorkeling out to this rock out here, you can see corals attached on the side of this granite boulder, growing off the side of it in these vertical structures, just like you see in the fossil outcrop. So that's a primary morphology, and you see that morphology only above the reef flat in 0 to 2 meters of water, which is the serendipity part of the story, because a lot of these corals can live across a wide range of water depths. So that gives us a high uncertainty on, where exactly was sea level above this coral. But in this case, we have this very narrow window of kind of 0 to 2 meters that helps us to really have a tight constraint on the past position of sea level at this particular site. So we looked at a number of sites across several of these granitic islands in the Seychelles. Here's Karen looking a bit glum in the field, but it turns out this was a great outcrop to work from. Even though they look like scrappy little outcrops, we were able to untangle a really amazingly preserved stratigraphy in many of these. And what was unique about this is because of their preservation, we can kind of observe them in 3 dimensions, which we usually don't have kind of access to looking at the reef in that way. And what we saw repeatedly in all these outcrops was a similar stratigraphy, in that we saw an episode of reef growth here at the bottom in blue. And then we saw these weird, we called them transition layers. In some cases, there was a layer of coral rubble that came in. In this outcrop, you see this hydrozoan coral called Millipora. It kind of grew laterally across, draped itself across the entire outcrop. And then you get another episode of reef growth. And you get another one of these transition layers, which again, depending on your outcrop, is either coral rubble or it's a Millipora. And then this last unit of reef growth at the top is very thin encrusting corals. It's kind of, I call it, referred to this last gasp of reef growth, which must have been in very shallow water based on the morphology of the corals that we preserve there. So we looked at these assemblages. We know that we're, again, in 0 to 2 meters of water. In some cases, we were able to refine that a little bit further. And our interpretation of what happened in these layers, along with the sedimentary evidence that I just mentioned, we also have some evidence, some of these, that these outcrops were exposed, that sea level fell, and then it rose again. And it turns out Millipora is one of the first corals to come in and colonize the surface of dead reefs. So sometimes after coral bleaching, for example, you'll see them come in and start to regrow. So our interpretation is that you had this episode of reef growth, and then the reef died. You had an ephemeral sea level fall, and you had another episode of reef growth as sea level rose. And so you have this episodic history of reef growth during the last interglacial, combined with evidence for some changes in sea level. So for those of you who are yearning to see some data, I put in one slide for you that you can sink your teeth into if you want to look at some data. I'll walk you through this in some detail because there's a lot that's on here. These are the uranium thorium data, the chronology that we have from these fossil corals in the Seychelles. So this is the time axis down at the bottom. So you have older ages on the right. These are thousands of years, remember. Moving to the left, this is the elevation in meters above sea level. And then each of these colors is a different outcrop. So I showed you several pictures of these outcrops just now, and these are only from outcrops that have kind of in situ reef framework that we can identify. So you can see that these the data we have from the different outcrops all overlaps with each other. So in other words, we were able to reproduce the timing and the elevations across several different outcrops. And these outcrops actually come from different islands as well. So we were surveying into sea level at different datums at different islands, yet they all plot right on top of one another. So this gives us extra confidence that we really are working within this kind of 0 to 2 meter range within sea level, because they're all sitting right on top of each other. In fact, some of them were 2 meters deep, they would be way down here. Some of them are a little bit deeper. You see these ones in blue. Those corals, I didn't show you pictures of these outcrops. They're hard to image because we collected these ones from caves that we had to walk into. So we think this is a slightly deeper water, quieter environment because these corals are sitting below these other ones that are growing right near the sea surface. So if we look at this trend, if we just connected the dots without any other context from the outcrop, we would just draw a line like this and say sea level rose steadily during this time period over thousands of years. You can put a line through it and calculate a rate and talk about the rate of sea level rise. But in fact, we know that's not what happened by looking at the sedimentary evidence. We had this episodic reef growth. We had this first reef. We have evidence in all of these outcrops that sea level fell, and we've been able to date the timing of that to constrain it somewhere around 126,000 years. Sea level rose rapidly again, and it fell again. And then we have the kind of peak sea level reached here somewhere between 122, 123,000 years ago, right? So we have these transitions that suggest sea level might have been rising slowly, but then it changed very rapidly and it went down and up during a warm period. And what could be possibly causing this? So one of the questions we have to answer here is this just something that happened at the Seychelles, or is this something that we see around the globe? So I'll show you another site very quickly that we've been working at in Western Australia. And this was the picture you saw on the title slide. Here to give you some context of where we are in the world. Here is the western half of the Australian continent. This little area here is blown up in these different panels. And Red Bluff is this site right here. And this white double-headed arrow is a map symbol that geologists use to designate what we call a doubly plunging anticline. This area has been tectonically deformed and is still being deformed. And what that has done to the fossil reef at Red Bluff is it's caused it to uplift. And so we have this whole reef exposed above sea level where we can walk around, climb on the outcrop and look at it. At most of the sites up and down Australia that people have worked at, you can only walk over the top of the reef and most of it is kind of submerged. This gave us a really unique insight into looking again at the evolution of this reef during the last interglacial. How did sea level evolve during that time period? Because we could walk along at least part of this cliff face. Some places it was too dangerous to do so, to look at the history of what happened here. So this is a picture where we're standing back here looking out towards the ocean. We looked at several different sites everywhere we could get into these coves to kind of describe the stratigraphy of these outcrops. And we managed to collect one long core using a very small drilling system through here to try to collect some that hadn't been exposed to weathering that would be better candidates for our dating technique. It was an interesting experience working here. Most people don't go to Red Bluff to do this type of work. This is the surfing mecca of Western Australia, as you can see in the background here. So there were a bunch of people with blonde hair and dreadlocks and a field team of 5 women geologists wearing field gear, which is an interesting contrast. But this was really an amazing site to work at because we learned a lot about what happened during the last interglacial here. And this was done, a lot of this work has been done by one of my students, Caroline Kwambek, who's not shown in this picture, and Kelsey Sanborn, who's a student of Jodi's at the University of Sydney. You may even be able to see to the untrained eye in these pictures that there is a difference in these outcrops as you go from the bottom to the top. The types of corals that we see down here at the bottom are different than these branching corals in the middle, which are different again from this assemblage that we get at the top, which are kind of these flatter, thicker, platy, tabular corals that we have at the top. And that's true in all of these outcrops as we walk down across this exposure here. What we see at Western Australia is what we see in the Seychelles. It's what we see at other sites around the world. We have evidence for episodic reef growth as we go up. We have some really extraordinary evidence for exposure of the reefs in the Western Australian example. I'm not going to take the time to delve into all the cool sedimentology here, but we have these kind of land-derived sediments that cover up the reef, and then we have sea level rises again. You get this rapid sea level rise with growth of corals. Then you have sea level fall, and you get sediment coming in from land again that covers the reef. and you get sea level rise again. So this is showing us that this is now a global pattern, because we're starting to see this at sites around the world. And it's not just unique to the Seychelles or one locality. So this is the emerging stratigraphy that we have, is that we have at these sites 2 to 3 episodes of reef growth that suggests kind of a pulsed sea level rise, if you will, separated by these episodes of sea level fall, which is rather intriguing. And I'm going to get to how we think that was caused in just a moment. There's another wrinkle to add to this story here too, is that at the beginning of the point where we're starting to grow this reef, sea level already appears to be well above modern sea level. Depending on which site you're at, somewhere between 3 to 6 meters above sea level when you already start seeing some of this growth, which suggests that it rose really rapidly right at the beginning of this sea level high stand, and then continued to rise more gradually. There's also some evidence independently from deep sea cores in the North Atlantic and also in the Red Sea. In this paper, they also had this idea that I proposed earlier, that the contributions from Greenland and Antarctica may have been out of phase. This is important because it could provide a mechanism for us to explain the pattern that we see here in the reefs. So if we go back to this budget that we looked at before, right? This was the cartoon I gave you for what we estimate the different ice sheets contributed at the peak of sea level rise during this past warm period. If we look at some of the models, these are just ice sheet models, not data, looking from Antarctica and 2 different models from Greenland during this sea level high stand. What these curves are showing you is that these models suggest that the Antarctic ice sheet retreated and contributed meltwater early on, and then it actually started to regrow as you started cooling in the southern hemisphere. Greenland, on the other hand, because it was warmer later in the last interglacial in the northern hemisphere, started off down here and then had its kind of peak retreat later in the last interglacial. These different models obviously showing different contributions, anywhere, as I mentioned before, from 2 to 5 meters worth of sea level rise coming out of Greenland. Now, if you were to add the green curve and the blue curve together, you would get sea level at about 6 meters here. If you add the orange and the blue, you get 9, which is, I think, total coincidence. It's our 6 to 9 meters range that we estimate for peak sea level. But remember, from the Seychelles, 122 to 123,000 years, this also matches in terms of the timing that we dated at that site for the peak sea level. So it's possible that we had this out of phase contributions between Greenland and Antarctica. And the way that helps us explain the data from the reefs is that when we have rates of melt in the northern hemisphere that exceed the rate of sea level fall that's being driven by this ice sheet growth in the southern hemisphere, then we create enough accommodation space for a reef to grow, right? So you're basically looking at these 2 ice sheets are competing. One is growing while the other is melting. And so it depends on which one is doing so faster as to whether sea level out in these tropical islands is rising or falling. And so the ephemeral falls may be moments when this Antarctic ice sheet regrowth is strong enough that it causes a brief fall in sea level, but ultimately the signal of sea level rise takes over and you grow the reef again. So that is our working hypothesis for what explains what we see in these fossil reefs and explains the timing that these ice sheets may have been out of phase with each other. So again, going back to this budget I showed you before, I suggested, well, even if we had 5 meters of sea level, maybe we don't need the Antarctic ice sheet. But that's where our chronology comes in handy, because our chronology shows us we already had 3 to 6 meters at the beginning of the interglacial period when Greenland had not contributed yet. And that's fairly well constrained by data that we have from Greenland. In that case, we put ages on these now. This is what the sea level budget may have looked like early in the interglacial. And to the left, what it may have looked like during peak sea level. So if we're going to get even 3 meters at the beginning of the last interglacial, we must be tapping into the Antarctic ice sheet, right? Even if Greenland later contributed 5 meters of sea level rise. So this is starting to look more convincing now, at least to me, as evidence, but it is evidence from the far field of us looking at how high sea level got, kind of looking at the summary of evidence that we have to try to estimate what is coming from where. I'm not going to actually read through this slide because I think I've already made most of these points. And I want to get to this last piece here, which is to circle back to where I started. I think we oftentimes use what's going to happen in the future as motivation for our research without returning to say, okay, what have we learned that can help us understand what's going to happen in the future? Did the West Antarctic ice sheet collapse during the last interglacial? What is our answer to that question? This is still being debated, is the real answer, by our community. But when you look at individual papers, some of which are represented by these different circles, different types of evidence, this circle, though, represents this whole body of literature that I've just been talking about. The weight of the evidence sits on the side that there is evidence that some sector of the Antarctic ice sheet did collapse, but it's hard for us to have basically direct field evidence from West Antarctica of that collapse at this point in time. There are a couple other studies over here that argue differently, but there's enough uncertainty in these. I think you could make the argument that they're kind of equivocal. So also, what is this tipping point from the Antarctic ice sheet? If we're right that the Antarctic ice sheet went early on, that tells us that we need to look at that time interval to understand how warm did the Southern Ocean get that made this retreat happen at this time to try to constrain that better. This is an image from the end of the Thwaites Glacier, which was one of those really fast moving glacial outlets that I pointed out to you in the image before. First time people ever went to this site was 2 years ago on a research cruise out there. There are people who've been studying the ice sheets in this region who argue that we're already retreated past that pinning grounding line position and that this collapse is already underway. This is also debated though, but I think this is kind of a moot point. We're either close to this point or we're past it, but nonetheless, we are melting it quickly enough that we will probably get past it if we are not already. So what does this mean for our future in terms of what we have learned? Sea level rise that we are seeing today is really just the first step in what's going to be a very long journey. As I suggested before, I think these ice sheets are out of equilibrium with the temperatures that we have today. We have a lot of melting yet to see, even from the warming that we have already done. We're learning something by looking at these records about the nature of sea level rise and how quickly that can happen. So we'll be able to answer some of these questions in more detail. Nonetheless, we already have more than enough information to tell us we need to act now on climate change and reduce our emissions as much as possible to help flatten the curve, if you will, as we move into the future. I think I'll end there and hopefully there's time for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that very clear and intriguing talk with a lot of cool images and data too. So yeah, open up for questions from anyone. Send in the chat, raise your hand.
Doug, you had your hand up?
Yeah. Really a great presentation. I've learned a lot and looked at some of those reefs myself. One thing that you might have data on, or I don't know if it's possible, obviously then when the temperatures of the oceans, whether they're in Greenland or Antarctica, depending on how warm they are or the currents, you can get more or less meltwater. Is there any studies or have there been on the changes in ocean currents and the temperatures of the ocean currents through time, through the last 100 years or so? Because that would make a difference too, and maybe also help to explain changes between Greenland and Antarctica if the patterns of the currents had varied and were not the same as they are today.
Yes. So I think, overall, continental configuration is the same. So you're not going to have major changes to ocean current, but you may have changes in the strength of those currents or the strength of the mixing or how deep the deep water formation gets. So we do have data on that for the last interglacial from different geochemical proxies. There's a lot of data in the North Atlantic. There is less in the Southern Ocean because it's not a very friendly place to preserve carbonate in the sediments. And we primarily rely on a lot of geochemical proxies from tiny carbonate shells in the sediment. So it gets harder the closer you get to the Antarctic continent to get those records. And it's harder to date those records in the Antarctic region also. So there's lots of data in the North Atlantic. In another different version of this talk, I also show a lot of data from the North Atlantic and show how it lines up with what we see in the reefs. And at that 126,000 years ago, where we see the reef B, that middle reef, take off, there appears to be a flux of fresh water into the North Atlantic that slows the circulation, it changes the temperatures, it pushes the polar front south. You see all these things lining up together. And so there's good evidence that that was probably what created the accommodation space for that reef to grow. But you're right that we can also look at the modern data, and there's data for that too, to look at how the strength of the currents has been changing, how the salinity has been changing, for example, across the North Atlantic basin. And we do see freshening at high latitudes and more evidence for evaporation and saltier at low latitudes. And so some of the patterns that we see now are kind of consistent with this whole picture. But remember, if we're forcing the hemispheres at different times in the last interglacial, it's going to do different things to the ocean current than if we're forcing them at the same time. So in other words, if we're running models, if we have meltwater just in the North Atlantic, it's going to be different than having meltwater in both at both poles at the same time. And that's something I think we need to look more closely at.
Great, thanks.
There is one question in the chat. I can read it to you from Eric Roden. These results are fairly terrifying. Unless I'm mistaken, no matter what we do in terms of greenhouse gas management in the next 100 years, humanity is looking at an average of something like 5 meters of sea level rise over the next few hundred years. Is this correct?
No, so only in terms of the time frame. So the question is, and I didn't fully answer this, the how quickly part is this going to happen? And the answer is quite resoundingly, we do not know. And that's what we're trying to get a handle on now. Is it going to be, like you said, a couple hundred years? Is it going to be 1,000 years, 2,000 years? I mean, that's a big difference if you're a coastal planner, right? That's a huge difference. So we're trying to get a handle on that in a couple different ways. And one is by trying to get chronology. So we've been going around coring into all of these outcrops now, just not looking at the surface, trying to how quickly do these corals grow one on top of another so that we can establish kind of rates of sea level rise to at least understand how quickly this process may have played out in the past. That would give us some constraint. The problem is for the ice sheet modelers is they don't have a full understanding of the physics of this rapid dynamic retreat. And what that means is that when they run the models into the future, there are different knobs that they can turn in some of the parameter space that are not well constrained. We haven't been around to witness that type of retreat before. And so that's how we are using what we see in the paleo record to actually calibrate some of those ice sheet modelers. So I'm working with some ice sheet modelers where they're using my data, and we go back and forth a lot on, what's the uncertainty and how can I tune my model? And if they can get their models to reconstruct what we see in the past, then presumably that's putting them in the right parameter space. And they use that to then run their models forward to give us a more robust projection of sea level rise. And there should be, I hope, a high impact paper coming to you soon on exactly that. But I'm not going to get the details now because it hasn't been fully accepted yet. So the question is the timing, and we just don't have the answer to that other than to say, we need to start preparing now and not just wondering if it's going to happen. It will.
But Andrea, if I may, just real quick, just to make this crystal clear, if the whole system responds like it did during the last interglacial, sometime in the coming millennia, we're looking at, even with the amount of warming that has taken place so far, 5-6 meters, sometime in the next 1,000 years-ish.
Yeah, so I think to be a good scientist, I have to say, I could talk myself into a case where maybe that's not true. It really depends on this issue of what was the tipping point? What were the temperatures of the water and how did we get there? because the forcing is not the same during the last interglacial. So it's not a perfect analog in that sense. And there's some evidence that what may have triggered it to collapse, if it did collapse early in the interglacial, it may have had to do with the dynamics of the transition from the previous glacial into that, which is a different thing. And so there's a question of whether it's perfectly analogous. Nonetheless, I still think, even if we're off by, several meters in some of these, it's irrelevant. We're still looking at major issues for our coastlines.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a couple more questions in chat. One was from Clifford Thurber. What factors control whether the southern or northern hemisphere warms first or faster, thereby controlling Antarctic ice sheet versus Greenland ice sheet melt timing?
Today or in the past? Or do you want me to answer both? I'll start with today. Both, great. All right, no, that's okay.
Yeah, whatever we know.
Yeah, we know both. So today, these are very different ice sheets. So Greenland is mostly responding to surface melt because, and Antarctica, in contrast, I like to think of it as its feet wet, because it has these over-deepened basins, these marine sectors that are very susceptible to the warming of the oceans around them. So while one is primarily being forced by the atmosphere warming above it, the other is being probably more significantly forced by the waters around it, although it's also feeling warming of the atmosphere as well, right? So they're responding in different ways. So then it depends on, okay, what's gonna matter first, the temperatures in the air over Greenland or in the water in the Southern Ocean. And so there's different dynamics at play there. In the past, it's a different story because, again, the forcing is different. We're not forcing them both at the same time. And so in that case, this transition from what we call marine isotope stage 6, the previous glacial period, into the last interglacial was much more rapid, actually, than this last deglaciation from the last ice age to present. And so what that means is you melted the ice that was in the northern hemisphere more quickly. That added a larger flux of fresh water into the North Atlantic. And there's something called the bipolar seesaw, which means that when you do that and you cool off the surface ocean of the North Atlantic, you end up trapping heat in the Southern Hemisphere. And that may have been the trigger for what caused the Antarctic ice sheet to collapse. So that's why I say the mechanism may have been a different thing. And that's why we really need to get a handle on, when did this happen? What was the tipping point and what caused it?
Cool, thanks. We have several questions coming in, but since we're past time, I'll just ask one more and then we'll kind of open it up more to the social, and hopefully some of those question askers who want to stick around, we can just kind of make it more of a chat. So one last one from Karen Russ, a little bit more on the politics of this work or how it's perceived. The question here is, did Florida make good use of your studies, or were you harassed for being a messenger, or both?
I always get harassed for being a messenger, doesn't matter where I am. Yes, I did spend a fair amount of time going to talk to organizations in coastal communities, speaking to politicians, speaking to real estate investors, all kinds of different people. And I think everyone in Florida, or a lot of people, they're aware of this problem. They understand that the sea level is rising. When I show them some of the things that we've learned from it, though, it's like you can see the penny drop. They're like, oh, I didn't realize it was quite this bad. And that to me is an important transition in their mindset. Now, how they're using it is a different question, because at the state level, for most of my time in Florida, the governor was Rick Scott, who forbade the words climate change to be used by any state agency in any report or in any way. So it's really hard to address this problem if you cannot even talk about it and use the words to do so. That has supposedly changed with Ron DeSantis coming in, and he appointed a climate czar who now finished her 1 year, wrote a report and is off, and they haven't done anything with it. So I don't really think anything has changed. I think so far that's also mostly been for show, but we will see. There are people at the local level paying a lot of attention to it. And that's where I got the most engagement. the state level, it's almost complete disengagement. And of course, at the federal level, we've obviously had a lot of struggles recently. Hopefully that's going to get better.
Well, thank you very much for the work you do and the fact that you are such a clear communicator that you've also made an impact to the public at large, which is fantastic. So we'll go ahead and quit the CPEP seminar portion of this talk. I just want to quickly announce that we actually have a back-to-back week of seminars. So next Monday at the same time at noon Central, we'll be having Miguel Goni, who is an oceanographer in Oregon State University, and also a good friend of mine because he was a co-editor of mine on the Journal of Geophysical Research. He's fantastic, and he does lots of cool studies in the Arctic off of ships, studying the biogeochemistry of oceans and the impacts of climate on that. So stay tuned for next Monday's talk. And with that,